Hello and welcome to Barn Walk, and we're on the solo today. We're still talking about Freddie DeBoer's article, "What People Want from Our Schools Have Never Been Accomplished Anywhere Ever," in his book, The Cult of Smart, from about 5 years ago. Now, I've spent an hour talking about both the fade out effects and behavioral genetics, with reference to environmental triggers and gene heritability, the variability in the Flynn effect, the reverse Flynn effect, the Flynn effect still going on in the developing world, um, focus on grit, etc., etc. But I want to go into some issues with Freddie's argument that I think we do really need to deal with, because while I think in the main I still mostly agree with what he's saying is going on, we don't actually have a crisis of schooling until very recently. He would say not at all. I would say there is one going on right now, and I've been in the classroom for frankly longer than him. um uh but nonetheless, I want to get into this a little bit, and then we're going to discuss one more article he wrote relatively recently, not in this episode, but on Friday's episode, to finally round off this discussion. Then we're going to go do something else for a little while, and I'm going to come back to education. I have another series about college education, responding to some other videos. They may also be fairly long, and they get into some very Utah-specific stuff, but that we can talk about in the context of the United States. So you can really get into the nitty-gritty of my day job. If we think about schooling as part of the apparatus of the managerial or administrative element of the state in its relation to capital, though, we need to talk about what the missions may be and why Freddie might be missing some things that we should pull apart. The stability of the achievement gap is a cornerstone of DeBoer's argument, because it uses a massive longitudinal data set that suggests that environmental interventions have a ceiling. We've talked about some of the possible criticisms of that from sociology, econometrics, and educational history, as well as some other issues with why there might be ceilings. Freddie's argument in his book, The Cult of Smart, not so much in the article at hand, does put some weight on genetics. I also think genetics is a factor, but I don't think it's the same factor as Freddie's. And even if I do accept that intelligence is largely a complicated set of genetic factors of which there is no single gene marker, I would still have an issue with some of the things being proffered, even though I more or less agree with Freddie that schools really haven't improved a ton. They're very good at doing what they do when you separate out for different demographic sets. The biggest ones being race, even more than and class. There are some factors there that are interesting, though, and we're going to get into that. So one of the things is that a gap is also based on a Wegg-Green hypothesis. Now, in 2015 to 2022, the PISA and NAEP data have been pretty bad, and they've been declining. But from the period between 1971 and 2003, we have seen real absolute gains. NAEP scores for Black and Hispanic students have actually improved at a faster rate than white students in several categories on the NAEP. A 13-year-old Black student's reading score rose by approximately 27 points between 1971 and 2023. Really, their high point was 2015, but we're going to stay on recent data, because at 2015 we started seeing declines in 8th grade, and then in 2022 we started seeing declines in 4th grade. But white students only rose by 12 points, meaning you did see improvement, but the improvement did not close the gap. The gap remained stable, not because disadvantaged students weren't improving, but because advantaged groups were also improving. If that's the case, then you're dealing with a red cream scenario where everyone is running faster just to stay in the relative same position to each other. The issue with this, though, is like I said, in literacy and math, there have been declines across the board after 2015. And there are some real problems in dealing with what this means. Two, Freddie mentions the trillions of dollars in spending, but economists might argue that this is misleading aggregate figure. Most of that massive infusion of cash was swallowed by rising costs that have nothing to do with instruction, such as healthcare for staff, pension obligations, and the explosion of administrative roles, which has really increased the staffing cost of schooling. In the last 20 years, teacher pay has actually declined relative to inflation. But payroll for most schools in the United States has actually doubled. If it's not teachers and it's not low paying unlicensed staff, then where is it? And it's consultants, administrators, assistant deans, cabinet members. You've seen an explosion of cost for high-end administrative workers. And increasingly it is seen as the only way to really get a decent job advancement as a teacher, because the teacher step pay tends to freeze pretty quickly. Now this varies from state to state, and we shouldn't generalize about it. I mean, the variance in teacher pay, even when adjusting for cost of living between states, is actually gigantic. And that has nothing to do with different levels of state policy. Per pupil spending has increased because of the cost of almost everything around schooling, but real research equity has not. High poverty districts still struggle to attract high quality veteran teachers as much as wealthy districts. All districts are struggling to attract new staff, although right now, what I predicted 10 years ago, which the schools would try to not make up their hiring gaps because they knew in the 2020s and 2030s that there was actually going to be big drops in population. And in fact, those drops of population are even larger than previously expected because of lack of immigration and rapidly declining birth rates. What one sees is actually that there's been very little invested in the instructional capacity of teachers, except in the area of things like programs and literacy programs being bought and this, that, and the other. But often training resources and stuff aren't there. And a lot of this money gets scooped up by consultants and administration. So while tons of money has been spent on it, it has not been on instruction. Now, Freddie wouldn't necessarily disagree with that, I think. He's pointing out that a lot of the interventions are superficial and that they're mainly based on fads and have very little efficacy in their implementation. And he's not wrong about that. But most people think somehow this is about teachers, and it's not at all. All right. The cost of educating a student, even per capita, has gone up dramatically in the past 20 years. It has not gone into teacher salaries. And remember that salaries are between like 90 and 93% of every district's spending. It hasn't gone into lunch ladies either. Hasn't gone into the front office ladies either, our front office people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's another thing you have to deal with. Sociologists argue that schools are being asked to solve problems that are outside of their walls, such as nutrition problems, equity gaps, larger social infrastructure problems. And since the 1970s, wealth inequality in the United States has skyrocketed. The Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality, rose from 0.39 in 1970 to 0.49 in 2021. That's huge. If the headwinds of poverty, housing, food insecurity, lack of healthcare are getting stronger, then schools keeping the achievement gap stable is actually a massive success relative to larger social conditions, which wouldn't actually hurt Freddie's argument. What he's actually saying is that we're not making gains because of things outside of school, and this would actually support that. So while some people have thrown this at Freddie, it's not actually a contradiction to his argument. The gap would have widely increased if there was not an increase in the efficacy of schooling. But again, that's Freddie's point. This is not about schooling efficacy. All right. Furthermore, there's some educational theorists who argue the NAEP and PISA or PISA measures very specific narrow type of school-based knowledge that has culturally tied to professionals in college-educated fields, which, Freddie would agree with that. And I think this is actually an interesting problem because the achievement gaps are often smaller on culture fair assessments are tasks like applied logic, which don't require a standardized vocabulary. So when you do logic based on pictures, the test results are a little bit better. Freddie relies on the NAEP because it's consistent across the board and almost everybody uses it. Now, whether or not that means he's accepting this general abstract managerial notion of intelligence is something we have to deal with. But Freddie's actually critiquing that. So while we could say that he is over relying on the NAEP, he might even agree with us. He's just saying that that's what administrators use. If the test itself is biased towards the linguistic and social habits of people heading to college, then the gap will always look stable because the test is designed to find a way to reward specific habits, which are those going into professional fields. The issue, though, is that, when you look at IQ and things like that, you also have problems. So you talked about the Flynn effect. And remember what I said is that if you look at how fast the Flynn effect has reversed itself, it's actually very clear that that can't be genetic. So that does lead us to a question of what's causing that. Lastly, there's a bit of historical data that you really do have to look at, which was the area of active desegregation. This is where you see things really change. Between 1970 and 1988, the black right reading gap for 17-year-olds was roughly cut in half. Since the late 1980s, American schools have somewhat resegregated, particularly outside of the Southeast because of the Civil Rights Act not applying to northern and western states. And thus that gap may have plateaued since the area of active desegregation. Now, I'm not sure that this is explanatory as a lot of people would like to say, but it does indicate that there were actually some heroic changes in the gaps between 1970 and 1988. And this does suggest that structural policies still do matter, but they're not a school site or schooling level issue. And again, Freddie might even agree with that. But it does kind of argue against his focus in the book solely so much on genetics. Now, the data from 1970 and 1988 is often cited as a smoking gun against the idea that achievement gaps are biologically fixed. During this period, So this is 18 years. The U.S. saw the most significant narrowing of Black right achievement gap in history, a shift that stalled almost exactly when a lot of desegregation efforts were rolled back in the 1990s. Were not expanded from the Southeast. In 1971, the gap was roughly 1.2 standard deviations. In 1988, it was about a half a standard deviation in overall reading scores. Now, we're talking just about reading scores, not IQ. So we might be comparing apples to oranges, but genetics don't change in 18 years, man. The only thing that changed was the sociogeography of schooling, meaning that different groups interacted with each other and peers brought each other up. This is actually consistent with Vygotsky and Soviet notions of zones of proximal development, and pairing people who can pull each other up. But the problem that you have, though, is there is some evidence that what we do in the United States, which is a total lack of tracking based off of this zones of proximal development theory, actually can also drag people down. And we have to parse that. So one of the things that has been argued is this period of 18 years between 1971 and 1988, there was a massive research transfer. Integrating schools meant that minority students finally gained access to the tax bases of wealthier neighborhoods, led to better laboratories, updated textbooks, and crucially, as this is the only thing that John Hattie's meta-analysis shows that even has a marginal effect, more experienced teachers. But if the gap is stable now, maybe it's because we stopped the transfer. Schools today are more segregated by race and class than they were in the 1980s, even though they are not formally so. This is just because of the nature of segregation of neighborhoods and the racial tracking of neighborhoods into social economic blocks. So whether or not this has to do with innate ability is an open question. In integrated environments, students from lower social economics often gain SARF knowledges from people who have skills that can help them, such as how to navigate bureaucracy, how to speak the language of professionals, how to code switch, how to access elite networks. I know there's been some backlash on the left to code switching because y'all haven't read Stuart Hall. And I know there are some issues with Stuart Hall, and I know there's even issues with the way code switching is used in different fields. But code switching is not just about like talking just like the people who you're socially interacting. It's also knowing how to change your register based on all kinds of social cues. There have been a lot of evidence that this peer effect actually did lead to more success on testing and more success on reading capacity because it gave people access to resources they didn't have even outside of school. And this was part of what was really effective in this time period that we're talking about between 1971 and 1988. Now, to really get fine grained with this, we'd have to look at a state by state basis, and I'm not going through all 50 states here. In 1988, this started to plateau. What really started happening was we started seeing the end of busing, the rise of charters. Charters come in at the end of the 1980s. You saw a beginning of hollowing out of the capacity of experienced teachers and relatively well-educated teachers come into the school system. So what changed was actually a bunch of social policies. On top of that, even though the gaps have stayed stable, that's also when you started seeing the effects of the decreasing wages and decreasing social infrastructure created by the public-private partnerships that were started all the way back under Jimmy Carter, but accelerated under Reagan, that we now call neoliberalism, really affected the entirety of the general economic order. And you had deindustrialization going on at the same time, which almost nobody in education really mentions as part of what seems to have stopped. You add all that together, and you have a problem. So we could sort of think about pairing Freddie with some other thinkers like Elizabeth Anderson or Boyle's and Gintis's views. So let's think about this for a second. On the point of equality, DeBoer argues that since we can't make everyone equal in ability, we should just provide a floor of comfort. Anderson will argue that equality isn't about matching IQ scores either, but it's about social standing and social power related to social standing. Similar to Marx, actually, Marx says that abstract notions of equality where everything ends in the same way is just not really worth even discussing because people are fundamentally different. There's nothing that's going to make me able to do shoveling as if I have my arm cut off as someone who has both arms and is relatively good health. Anderson wrote in The Imperative of Immigration, quote, "The point is not to reward people for their merit, as often just a combination of lucky genes and lucky upbringing. The point of democratic equity is to end social relationships of dominance and hierarchy." And while that's not written in a Marxian way, because we're more concerned about economics, it's essentially the same point that Marx makes. The point of power egalitarianism is not to do away with natural differences. You can't. And people, I have someone's like, oh, well, you just, don't deal with these hidden orders and elites. And I'm like, I deal with them all the time. These elites aren't consistently better, and in fact they're showing the same declining tendencies as everyone else and maybe faster. So what's your point? Are you just trying to naturalize hierarchies because you fucking like them because they benefit you? So DeBoer and Anderson would both agree that merit is a framework that's fake. Anderson would say we should stop caring about wanking altogether and focus on whether or not a janitor can look a doctor in the eye as a political equal. And to some degree, great. But the thing is, we still do have to deal with training people for a world where we need people with all sets of skills. And if people can hoard those skills and hoard those opportunities, they will set up elite capture for themselves. And there's something you have to deal with. Saying that we all should be abstractly equal does mean that we have to find a way to make people abstractly equal in a real abstract way, and not just by asserting, oh, you're somehow equally valuable in your soul. It means actually having to deal with things like sortition, skill sharing, sorting by other means of merit, etc., 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 and not focusing on the top end like we do in the United States, which is often trying to fix things like by affirmative action being applied to higher colleges and schools and not lower down, where the real problems and base skills really lie. Particularly because affirmative action can be gained, as I've talked about a lot in the past, by accepting a lot of elite people who just fit the demographic category you're trying to fill in, and even doing it from other countries. Boyles and Gintis and Schooling in Capitalist America said that the educational system does not add to the mental capacity of the worker so much as it socializes them in the hierarchical relations of the workplace. Which also means that maybe all that money spent that Freddie's complaining about isn't actually about what he says it is, and the professed impossible goal, which he is right, is impossible. To have a school system that both sorts people and also equalizes them has never been real in the first place, and that's just something that people tell educators and the public so they don't get on with what's actually being done. And particularly liberals in the academia themselves who don't want to deal with the fact that they might be talking about how to help the oppressed, but living in a system that fundamentally sorts people's social access in a way that is not going to stop oppression. So one of the things that Gintis and Boyles would suggest is what happened between 1971 and 1988 wasn't just about kids getting smarter. It was about kids getting social capital through learning institutional languages that were closed off from them and getting access to things that could help them throughout their lives, including access to white peers with more social capital and wealth. One of the things that we could maybe worry that Freddie might be dealing with is whether or not he becomes a lucky egalitarian, which is the idea that we should only compensate for things people didn't choose, like their genes, as opposed to things that were incentivized for them, but they did choose. Lucky egalitarian, according to Elizabeth Anderson, and she wrote this in What is the Point of Equity, turns a state into a Jupiter that monitors the natural assets of its citizens. It requires the states to make insulting private judgments about how naturally disadvantaged someone is and then treat them accordingly. I've talked about Jeff Smith's Disciplined Minds, and he says this way of doing things and also focusing on privilege as a point where instead of other forms of equity and removing privilege are removing handicaps or handling handicaps in this way is actually about these sort of naturally disadvantaged judgments, which the state comes in, or the school comes in, or the 504s and the IEPs come in and equalize. Remedialization is patronizing. If we agree with Anderson and DeBoer here, we can think about it in a couple ways. DeBoer is just saying that we can't run a society off of merit because merit would never be equalized, and that we are putting too much emphasis on one form of merit, and he thinks that we should deal with that. Whereas Anderson and maybe even Marx would say that that's beside the point. Anderson would focus on dignity. Marx would focus on beginning to create the situation that would allow eventually from each to their own ability, from each to their own needs. And on that, we're going to stop for today. I think we've talked about this article and the cult of smart enough for a while. A lot of the things I've brought up as criticisms of Freddie aren't actually good criticisms of Freddie. And a lot of the things that I do think are good criticisms of Freddie, such as the reverse Flynn effect, the limits of heritability studies and behavioral genetics, that there's a technological problem I think we need to deal with. And I don't think we've discussed the technological problems and the implications of that enough either. But I'm going to save that for some other videos in the future. For now, I'm going to wrap this and say on the next one of these videos, we're going to talk about the school reformer accountability gap, which was another Freddie DeBoer article. And then we're going to leave Freddie alone for a while. And we're going to talk about what the point of a critic is. And then we might finally go back to my What is Politics series and talk about Plato's notion of politics. Then we'll probably go back to schooling for a while. And then, I don't know, by the fall, we will come back to imperialism and talk about what the theories of imperialism are after the Soviet Union is established and after 1921. So we'll get the Stalin and Mao and post-Maoist theories and world systems theory, versions of imperialism, et cetera, and some of the problems related to imperialism as a concept that have developed since this time and why none of us agree on any of it. Now, on that note, we're going to come back on Friday. Take care, protect your peace, like and subscribe, hit the bell. We have a Patreon where you can subscribe for as little as $4 a month. I am doing a mini class from June 22nd to July 3rd, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 2 sessions a day, so you can pick morning or evening, and it'll be approximately 2 hours a session. So it is 6, 7, 8, 9, 12. 12 hours overall. Prices vary depending on if you're a patron or not, but they're less than $50, or they're $50 or less. For these sessions on the great controversies of Marxism, we're going to do 4 of them. And I'm probably going to be doing this on my breaks for a while. And the first 3 or 4 of these classes are going to be just controversies in Marxism. Also, if you want some self-study guides, I've gone through and made them for key topics for particular left-wing scholarly and activist journals, and on topics, reading guides that you can pick up, find the readings. A lot of times I try to provide them online, but some of them are books. You got to find them. Set up a group on your own and go through and read them with key terms, discussion guides, reading questions, etc., for you, and a scope and sequence for you to teach yourself. It's completely for free. It's on my Patreon, but you don't even have to be a free subscriber. You can just find my Patreon and pull them off. I just got tired of only sectarian organizations making these things, and I started making them for all sorts of stuff. I have some coming out on the materialism controversies in the 18th and 19th and 20th century and its relationship to Marxism. But I'm going to have some ones coming out too on Plato and some other things. So it's not just all Marxist stuff all the time, but I have been going through and doing the histories of understanding certain concepts with reading lists, developments, what you need. Sometimes even with historical guidance notes. These are generated from my own notes. I check the references. I've read them at some point anyway. Or if they're from a journal, I often work with editors of those journals to get these things done and out to you. So you want to interact or you want to teach yourself, we have more here. We're going to continue our low production values and me talking at you, but nonetheless. And if you want more than that, the Patreon, for as little as $4, you can get more. We have levels up to $15, but you're going to get most of the things actually for $4. I try to make it affordable on purpose. I could make more money if I rose the price, but I'm not going to do it. I've only raised it once in 5 years, and I don't see myself changing that anytime real soon, particularly in this recession, even though, man, prices are going up. But I'm not going to do that to you. My costs are relatively low and they're covered by my current Patreon, so I don't need to raise prices. Thank you. Have a good day. Protect your peace and keep focusing on how to build a better tomorrow.